Hi everyone, Heather here with Astrology with Heather.com, and I am back with another exciting weekly forecast. This one is for Monday, October 1st, all the way through to Sunday, October 7th of 2018. And this week we have another really exciting week in the astrology. A lot going on, especially because Venus, the planet that rules love, relationships, beauty, pleasure, self-image, women, the feminine energy, balance, harmony, all of these wonderful, beautiful things, is actually stationing on Friday the 5th to move retrograde. And so a Venus retrograde only occurs once every couple of years, about roughly once every 2 years. And I believe the last time we had Venus in retrograde, it was in Aries. This time it's going to station to go retrograde in the sign of Scorpio, and then it's going to move backward into its home sign, which is Libra. And so this is going to be affecting a lot of people in a lot of different ways. It's going to be affecting us in relationship. It's going to be affecting us in finance. It's going to be affecting us in terms of our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-image. And so we'll get into all of that in just a second. But before we do, I just want to do a quick reminder and announcement for those who are not already aware that I am doing a really in-depth live webinar with Robert Phoenix on October 20th, all about the end of the year shifts that will be occurring with Jupiter moving into Sagittarius and with the North and South nodes, and the eclipses moving into the signs of Cancer and Capricorn. And so on October 20th, we'll be going really in depth into how this is going to affect all of us on an individual and collective level. We'll give specific indications by sign and by planetary transit. And so if you want to sign up for that, the link is in the description right down below. And so anyway, so coming back to the astrology for this week. So Venus retrograde does a lot of different things. When Venus is in retrograde, a couple of different things occur here. So when Venus is in retrograde in the natal chart, it brings up issues involving self-worth and feeling inherently unlovable or unworthy of unconditional love. And usually that sensation or that feeling is innate from childbirth. It's not something that you develop necessarily through conditioning or through your early childhood environment. It's usually something that you just feel innately. And even though your early upbringing doesn't appear to support that feeling of being unlovable or like something's wrong with you or you're not good enough, usually you'll feel that way anyway. Whereas with other specific Venus configurations and aspects and alignments in the birth chart, there's usually some sort of childhood experience that conditions you to feel in a way like that. So with the Venus retrograde, there's usually an indication, or at least there's a belief that this might have to do with past life experience, right? And so it could be that in a previous lifetime, you're carrying over an experience of unlovability, of not feeling worthy of love, of hurt, of pain, of, some sort of psycho-emotional damage from a relationship that occurred in that lifetime, right? And so when Venus goes retrograde, especially for those who are going to be most affected, which will be people who have their rising sign in Taurus or in Libra or in Scorpio, people, especially Taurus and Scorpio, people who have this transit happening over their sun, their moon, their rising sign, their natal Venus, right? Any of their personal planets, they're going to be feeling this the most. And it can bring a sensation of awkwardness or not feeling good enough, or feeling getting your feelings hurt, feeling unrecognized for what it is that you're doing out in the world, feeling just not quite up to yourself, or like you're not living up to your potential. Especially for women, it can, lower your self-esteem a little bit. Or I've also seen with Venus going retrograde, especially during its stationary positions, people get like an inflated sense of self-esteem with these alignments where they feel extra good. And then as it goes retrograde and tends to move backwards, or starts to move backwards, there can be something that damages your pride, damages your ego, takes you down a peg or two. And so that can be part of the Venus retrograde experience for some people. There also is usually a lot of people want to change their appearance when Venus is in retrograde. When Venus is in retrograde, it's 3 times closer to the Earth. So the energy of Venus, which rules like our aesthetic, right? It rules the way that we show up on a physical level in terms of our appearance. It rules, beauty and, beauty products and things like plastic surgery and, other sorts of skincare and beauty regimens and things like that are all under the influence of Venus. And so when Venus is so strong in the skies, people, especially when they're really heavily influenced by it, because there's like a really intense transit going on or something with Venus, especially with women too, they tend to want to change their appearance. And this is not an advisable time to do that. And so when Venus is in retrograde, you might overdo it. You might change something too drastically. And then usually when it goes direct, you're like, why did I do that? So this is not the time to chop off all your hair. This is not the time. Definitely this is not advisable in terms of plastic surgery. I don't do electional professionally for clients for surgery, for electional surgeries and things like that. But I will say that, I have a friend, and she probably won't mind me sharing this because you don't know who she is, but she, last Venus retrograde, wanted to get her breast implants replaced because you're supposed to do that every so often. And so she thought because it was like a redo that doing it during a Venus retrograde might be okay. So she scheduled this appointment and sent me the chart for that appointment and that date. And I was really concerned based on the chart, and especially with Venus being in retrograde, that she'd have to go back in and redo it, right? Because it wouldn't be what she wanted. It wouldn't turn out right. And then the chart that she gave me, I can't remember specifically what was going on, but I got this strong impression that if she did it on that day, at that time, in that location, that she would end up with internal bleeding and the implants would be too large. And she would have pain, and she'd have to kind of go back and correct it. And so she didn't do it. She picked another date, and they turned out wonderful. But she had a close friend who on the same day in the same city with a different doctor got her breast implants for the first time done. And everything that I said that was going to happen, like, happened to this other person instead. So they were too large. They were very painful, and there was internal bleeding, right? So anyway, the moral of the story is when Venus is in retrograde, that's not the best time to do a cosmetic procedure. Now, I'm probably going to get a bunch of comments and questions and things like that about people wanting to do, like, chemical peels and things like that right now. Don't do that if you can avoid it, right? If it's electional, if you don't have to do it, don't do it. If it's something that you absolutely have to do for some reason, like you have breast implants and they burst and, it's an emergency, obviously do that. But yeah, so it's not a good time to cut off all your hair. It's not a good time to dye your hair a crazy color. If you're erring on the side of being more conservative, then yeah, Venus retrograde can be okay with that. The other thing too that comes up with the Venus retrogrades is buying things, because Venus rules finances. And so this is a really great time to do things like shopping at thrift stores and repurposing things. So thrift shopping, finding good deals, right? Being really frugal with your spending. So you can search out and find really good deals on, products, on whatever it is that you want, vehicles and things like that, used, right? Not to get some sort of new luxury, like crazy car or something like that. This is really, you need to err on the side of less is more when Venus goes into retrograde, but you can find really good deals around these time periods. And this is the best time to go thrift shopping. This is the best time to go antiquing. This is the best time to repurpose like old things and make them beautiful again. So Venus retrograde is great for that. But if you want to buy something new and luxurious, and it's something that you normally wouldn't buy, but you really want to splurge on it, you're probably going to regret that purchase later on down the line when Venus moves direct, right? And so this isn't the case for every single person. Everybody's chart is a little bit different, but in general, that's sort of a general rule. The other thing that happens a lot is, and also renegotiating your finances. So how do they call it? Refinancing something, right? That is a good utilization of Venus retrograde. Getting a new loan or something like that, maybe I would wait if you could. So anyway, so those are sort of the general rules. The other things that happen when Venus is in retrograde is that you can reconnect with people from your past in the area of life that's being affected. So you'll find that past relationships will come back around, especially in Scorpio. It's going to be, for the first couple of weeks, it will be in Scorpio. Especially in Scorpio, it's going to be rehashing, and digging up old wounds, old traumas, old difficulties, old sort of psychological and emotional baggage in relationships that needs to be brought up to the surface and sort of released and transformed and let go. And so a lot of times these relationships will come back in a way that feels very karmic, that feels a little intense, a little heavy even, especially again in that sign of Scorpio, but that's okay because there's something that you need to revisit. Sometimes it's that you need to reintegrate that relationship back into your life, right? So it's you kind of like let that person fall away and they're coming back into your life for a reason when Venus is in retrograde. Maybe there's a part of your contract with that person in this lifetime that hasn't been fulfilled yet. And so it's coming back around and now it's the time to fulfill that contract or agreement with that person. And that could be on a physical, like earth plane level, or, the contracts and agreements we make before we come into this lifetime with certain people. The other thing is that when you initiate a new relationship, any new relationship, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. So if you make new friends, if you meet, a new coworker that starts at your job or something like that, if you come into a romantic relationship especially, these people are not going to be who you think they are. So people don't tend to project themselves as they are during Venus retrograde. They act differently. They show up differently. Their image is different. And so who you think they are is not who they're going to be. So if you get somebody who comes into your life and they are, really just frumpy and mean and you don't get along, you can find that when Venus turns direct that you might actually get along with this person and it might be great. So, give people the benefit of the doubt because you don't know what they're going through during this time and they're not projecting outwardly what it is that they're feeling internally and who they actually are, especially if they're being really heavily affected or afflicted by this Venus retrograde. Positive aspects can bring a lot of really great benefits, of course, per usual. Negative aspects with Venus are going to be even more difficult than they normally would be just because Venus is so close to the earth and it's moving backwards, right? So it's a sense of having to go back and revisit something in your relationships, to redo something. It's not a good time to do brand new things with finances, relationships, or, any like your appearance, all those things that we talked about, right? But it is a good time to go back and redo things to sort of hone in on something, to sort of restructure your old contracts and old relationships. That's really what retrogrades are for. So, if you do come into a relationship that starts during the Venus retrograde, I've seen it not work out well in my own life and in the lives of a lot of my clients and friends, but sometimes it does work out. So, just keep an open mind. Everybody's being affected differently by this Venus retrograde and what's going on in their chart. But for the most part, I've seen that people tend to not be what they seem. And so if you enter into a new relationship in the Venus retrograde, a couple different things typically occur. Again, this is in general. It's not the same for everyone, but one of the things is that person might be different than what you think they are after you are a couple months into the relationship. The other thing is it's harder to get out of that relationship, and it can bring on again, off again relationships a little bit more so than other aspects in the chart. I've only had one on again, off again relationship in my past history, and because I don't have that supported in my chart, right? It's not something that's innate in my chart, but that relationship was started during a Venus retrograde. And so you'll be going back and forth with this person because it's hard to see them clearly even after Venus goes direct. So just be aware. And so again, not a good time for major changes in your style and your relationships. Even if you end a relationship during this time, it can come back around. So that's another thing with the Venus retrograde. So if you end a relationship during Venus retrograde and you don't want it to have ended, it just did, it might come back around after Venus goes direct. If you actually truly want to end a relationship fully, or a contract of some kind or an agreement, it doesn't have to be a romantic partnership, waiting until after Venus goes direct is sort of a more favorable time to do that because it's not as likely to come back around, right? Because anything that you do during Venus retrograde, the Venus is going to be moving over that spot in the zodiac backwards, and it's going to come back around and hit that exact same point again in the future. So you're going to have to revisit it in one way or another. So if you want a clean break, you want to be done with something, you're trying to break out of some old contract that you don't want to be in anymore, as long as you're okay with the fact that you're probably going to have to make adjustments and it's probably going to come back up and you're not fully going to be done with it, then, go for it. But otherwise, wait a little bit longer if you can. So those are the general sort of rules, survival tips for Venus going retrograde. Venus in retrograde is not normally as overtly intense or difficult as some of the other retrograde planets. Usually it's a little bit more subtle, and the things that the difficulties show up when Venus goes direct again, and you're like, the veil drops or whatever it is, and you're kind of like, what did I just do? This is not what I thought it was. These appearances were not what was going on behind the scenes, behind the mask, behind the veil, whatever it is. So so that's Venus retrograde. And so we're going to be going over this for all 12 signs. The only other major aspect that's going on next week is going to be Mercury square Pluto on Tuesday, which is really good for really focused, intense mental energy, but it could bring up a lot of intense conversations, a lot of sort of intense communication over the media, over the internet, and a lot of intense communication in our lives in general. So it could bring up and dredge up a lot of difficult conversation. But it's a fleeting aspect. It doesn't last long. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is when that's most extreme, and that's going to sort of fall by the wayside. So the main event for this week is going to be that Venus stationing to go retrograde. And so I'm going to get into the forecast for all 12 signs. And per usual, this is a general forecast. And it's best to listen to your rising sign first. Your sun sign is secondary. Your rising sign will usually be most accurate. And this is using, I get a lot of questions about these things, so I like to just reiterate in my videos. But when I do the general forecast, I use whole sign houses. So this will be applicable for anyone, you know, with Aries rising, Taurus rising, etc. Your sun sign will also be applicable, and your moon sign you might want to listen to. Just because some people like that, especially if you have like really strong lunar energy in your chart, like a lot of Cancer or something, it might affect you a little bit more than some of the other signs. So that's what's going on there. And so because this is a general forecast, if you want to have a more specific individualized interpretation of the astrology or of this Venus retrograde coming up, you can always book a reading with me. The link is in the description below. All right, guys. So for Aries and for Aries rising, Venus retrograde is actually happening in your 8th house. And the 8th house is a really, really intense space in the natal chart. So Venus retrograde in the 8th house can bring up a lot of really old traumas, old wounds, old insecurities, old power struggles in relationships, a lot of deep stuff. So this is a time for deep inner work when it comes to your relationships. You might have a lot of intense situations that have occurred for you in relationship might come back around in another way with another person, or that person that you had those experiences with might come back around, and you might have to sort of look at and address that. This is the time for you to work through your fears, insecurities, vulnerabilities, deep wounds and traumas in relationships, so that way you can come out sort of triumphant, right? So you can become healed, right? So you can become transformed, so you can become much more empowered in your relationships, because the 8th house is the house of empowerment. And so Venus is stationing in that 8th house for you. Venus will go all the way back into Libra, which is your 7th house. And so when Venus moves into Libra, it's going to be more about just past relationships in general. That's a good time to revisit old contracts, to, refinance something or to renegotiate contracts or agreements. A lot of sort of rehashing things in relationships can come about at that time. This is going to be a time, for Aries and Aries rising, especially when Venus goes back into Libra, where a lot of unusual sort of karmic circumstances in relationship can come up for you. So that way you can sort of work through it or reintegrate that old relationship in order to move forward in a better space, right? While Venus is in Scorpio, because Venus will be going back and forth, this is also a really good time for, again, refinancing things, right? Because it's the 8th house, renegotiating the terms of something involving joint finances. This isn't a good time to necessarily take out a new loan or something like that, but this is the time when you could pay off old debts, or you could sort of renegotiate the terms and agreements of some sort of, contract or something like that that is not necessarily favorable to you, so it leaves you feeling disempowered. So this is about getting rid of anything in terms of contracts and relationships, your own self-image and your own self-worth as well, that leaves you feeling disempowered, that leaves you feeling like you're not in control of your life. And, it's going to go back into that 7th house. So a lot of really sort of karmic, strange, and unusual situations can come up, especially involving past relationships. And if a new relationship does come around, that's one of those situations where you need to sort of tread lightly a little bit, at least at first, because, people who show up in your life, especially with this 7th house being activated, it might not be who you think that they are. And if you enter into a new contract or agreement, it might not be what you believe it's going to be. So just kind of be aware of that. This is, again, a really good time. With Venus in the 8th house, this is like the best time for repurposing things, for taking old stuff and making it new. So if you're really into like getting old furniture and, refinishing it and making it beautiful again, reupholstering things, that type of thing, redecorating something, like taking something old and repurposing it and transforming it into something beautiful and new again, that's like one of the best things you could do with this Venus 8th house energy, because that's really supported there. Same thing with relationships, right? Take an old relationship that maybe is starting to fizzle out, reignite the passion and sort of change it and make it new again, right? Transform it. That could be another good utilization of that energy as well. All right, and for Taurus and Taurus rising, Venus is stationing to go retrograde in your 7th house of, marriage partnerships, relationships, any sort of long-term, close, committed partnership is represented in the 7th house. It doesn't even have to be like a long-term, close, committed partnership. Even things like clients show up there. So this is a time for Taurus when old relationships from the past can really come back around for you to examine and look at and sort of either resolve any old traumas or deep issues that came up for you throughout that relationship, and so that way you can let it go and surrender it finally and fully. Or maybe you need to reintegrate that relationship back into your life, and so it just kind of depends on what's going on for you and the nature of that relationship. This is a really good time for renegotiating contracts and agreements. Not a good time for entering into new contracts and agreements, because they might not be what they seem to be or what they appear to be at first glance, or the people that you're engaging in these interactions with, they might not be what they appear at first, right? Because as I mentioned before, people don't necessarily show up as they are when Venus is in retrograde. Venus will be retrograding all the way back into your 6th house, which should bring up, it could bring up different issues involving coworkers, health, your daily routines. It could be just as simple as you trying to sort of rebalance and reconfigure your daily routines so you have much more harmony, much more equilibrium in your day-to-day life or in your work life. It could be you renegotiating some sort of financial situation with your work, or it could just be old coworkers and, or people that work for you coming back into your life, coming back around, so that way you can either reintegrate them into your life, or maybe because there's some sort of message they need to deliver, or there's some sort of old karma that needs to be resolved and let go of, so that way you can move forward. So a lot of times when you have Venus retrograding in the 6th house, you can have people from your past, especially people that you used to work with or work for, that can come back around, and you might have to sort of revisit that. This could also bring like old situations from the past involving doctors or healers of different kinds that could come back around, where maybe you decide to revisit that, right? You might decide to reschedule a new appointment with this person. So those types of things could come around. But in general, this is going to be bringing up old past relationships, past relationship trauma, insecurities, anything that was really intense, any deep psychological issues that are left over from previous relationships might come back around, either through that past relationship coming back around, or in your current relationship, or just in general in your mind, right? You might be working through some stuff, especially at the beginning of this transit while Venus is transiting through Scorpio. Because you are a Venus-ruled sign, this is going to be especially intense for you when Venus stations, especially if you have your sun, moon, or rising around 10 degrees in the sign of Taurus. So I would say anywhere from like 7 to like 13 degrees, that would be probably a good orb range there for you feeling this a little bit more intensely. And if you do have your sun, moon, or rising at those degrees, or anywhere really from 10 degrees to 0 degrees Taurus, at some point during this transit, you could have an old relationship come back, and that could sort of hurt your pride, hurt your ego, or it could cause you to feel badly about yourself in some sort of way. But that doesn't mean it's going to last. It doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way. It's just something that's going to be happening for a short time. And then when Venus goes direct, you're going to feel much better about yourself and much more optimistic moving forward, right? You're going to feel much more beautiful, much more charismatic. You're going to be lit up. So when Venus is going direct over or in opposition to your ascendant, that can be a good thing. But yeah, so that's kind of what's going on for Taurus and Taurus rising. For Gemini and for Gemini rising, Venus is going retrograde in your 6th house. So this could bring up sort of old situations from the past involving past coworkers, involving people in your life that have to do with work or with health or with nutrition, like how I mentioned before for Taurus. It could be old doctors, healers, nutritionists, whatever it is, physical trainers, people that you've worked with in the past on a health level that you might decide to bring back into your life, reintegrate, revisit that program or that situation that they were, getting you into or that they were helping you with. This could also be people from the past in your work that might be coming back around that you have to sort of either work through and deal with issues from the past from that relationship so you could move forward with greater clarity so the contract can be ended so you can get on with your life. Or it could be that you're reintegrating this person back into your life. So it could be an old, coworker that turned into a friend that maybe you haven't seen in quite some time, and maybe you run into them, or maybe they contact you, or maybe you just feel the urge to contact them. And, usually if that happens, there is a reason for it, because there's something that is left unresolved or unfinished, and you're going to be resolving that through this transit. With Venus going back into the 5th house of romance, this could definitely bring up old flames, old love affairs, old romances, maybe even some new ones where the person might not be who you think they are or who they appear to be at first, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be, something bad moving forward. It's just not going to be the same as what you think it is. But with Venus going retrograde into the 5th house, this is a time to revisit old hobbies, old passions, old interests, things that you used to really love to do, especially things that are creative, right? Because that's very Venusian, that are creative or beautiful or artistic in some sort of way. And also this is so you can reintegrate that, right? So some sort of old passion, some sort of old hobby, some sort of old interest that you like to do. Maybe you used to play music or something and you stopped doing it and it was just kind of a hobby. It wasn't necessarily something you did professionally, but maybe this Venus retrograde inspires you to go back and revisit that instrument you used to play, right? And that could be just one example of many creative pursuits or passions that could be reignited by this Venus going in retrograde. But like I said, this could also bring up old romances, old flames, especially love affairs, boyfriends, girlfriends, that type of thing, where they come back around and come back into your life. If that's the case, it's because there's something that's been left unfinished, right? And so it's either an opportunity to reintegrate that person back into your life or to resolve old karma or past sort of issues from that relationship that were sort of left unfinished, that were never fully resolved and finalized. And so that's for Gemini and for Gemini rising. For Cancer and for Cancer rising, this energy is happening in your 5th house. And so it's we have Venus stationing in your 5th house. And so in Scorpio and in the 5th house, this could bring up really intense and difficult relationship issues from the past, especially involving like love affairs, flings, really passionate, exciting relationships that maybe were a bit too intense. This could bring up a lot of past wounds, vulnerabilities, issues, insecurities, fears involving relationships and romance that maybe need to be resolved. And so that can come through either your own mind and you just thinking about these things and maybe bringing them back up and working through these issues yourself, or this can come through the form of a new relationship or a past relationship coming back around. This is also a really good time to revisit hobbies, interests, passions, things that you really love to do from the past that maybe you've sort of let fall by the wayside and you haven't really looked at in quite some time. And so with Venus retrograding in your 5th house, it's a time to revisit and reintegrate those passions, especially if those hobbies and those things that you love to do have some sort of creative component to it, right? Because that's Venus. Venus is all about, beauty and aesthetics, but it's also art. And so, like I said, with Gemini rising, when it goes back into Libra for them, this could be a time when, maybe there's some sort of creative project that you haven't sort of worked on in quite some time. Maybe, you used to paint, or you used to sing, or you used to do something along those lines for fun because you loved it. And maybe you need to reintegrate that back into your life. So those are all things that could come back around for Cancer and Cancer rising. The second half of this retrograde is actually going to be in your 4th house of the home and family. And so this could be rehashing or revisiting old problems or old issues in relationships with family members in particular. And so it could be that, you know, people in your family, or people from your childhood even, that you haven't spoken to or even thought about in quite some time, they might come back around and contact you through this transit. This could be you having to either resolve and let go of past issues with family members, or to reintegrate those family members after things are sort of forgiven and everything comes back into balance and back into harmony. So this is a really good time for forgiveness, for coming back into balance in your family relationships, sort of renegotiating the terms of your relationships with your family members, right? Changing the structure of those relationships. This is also a really good time for redecorating your home if you do it in a way where you're repurposing things, right? So this would be a really good time to go through and purge a lot of old stuff that you don't want anymore in your home environment. And this would be a really good time to plan for a renovation, but not to do it. And this could be a good time to take something that's old and like rusty or falling apart and to refinish it and to make it new again, right? So if you have that paint peeling on the side of your house, just repaint it. Don't pick a crazy color because you probably regret that with Venus retrograde. But, you know, pick something a little more subtle than what you might think if you are going for a big change there, but like repainting something, right? Making things beautiful, making things renewed in your home environment. This is not a good time for luxurious spending on, you know, home goods and things like that. If you're going to go out and buy like a, you know, $10,000 couch or something crazy, you're probably going to regret it, unless that's something that you normally do, right? Which some people do. But spending on things that are more luxurious than what you're used to, or that are crazier colors, and doing things that are a little more unusual in terms of the aesthetic of your home, that's not necessarily favorable. But this is really good for, like I said before, repurposing, making things beautiful again, and for making your relationships with your family members beautiful again. So, you know, good things can come from this Venus retrograde. All right, for Leo and for Leo rising, Venus is stationing to go retrograde in your fourth house. And so this could bring up old wounds, old insecurities, old fears, old traumas involving your early childhood experience, or your relationships with your family members. This could also bring up old issues involving loss or death involving the family, involving members of the family, right? Not new issues, but old issues. If you haven't worked through the trauma or the grief of such a situation, that can come back around because it's Scorpio, right? People who have Leo rising, especially if Scorpio is the ruler of your IC, tend to have sort of intense experiences in their early childhood. That doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, it's just intense. And so you might be revisiting some of those intense experiences with your family members. Family members who you haven't spoken to in quite some time might come back around, and you might have to reintegrate them back into your life, or you might have to work on renegotiating the terms or the structure of your relationship so that way you can feel much more empowered within that relationship. And so you can let go of old wounds, old traumas, old insecurities, in order to feel more empowered within your family unit, within your family system. So a lot of, you know, family stuff could be coming up for Leo and for Leo rising. This is, again, you know, a good time to like redecorate, but not necessarily change a lot of things. It's like if there's something in your house that's falling apart, this is a good time to make it beautiful again, to make it new, to renew it, right? But if you want to just like completely color your walls like crazy colors and buy really luxurious items for your home, I would maybe hold off on that until Venus goes direct, because you might regret it after the fact when Venus does go direct if you do it while it's retrograde. So, yeah, and then Venus will be going into your third house, which is the house of communication. And so when this happens, Venus being in Libra, this is going to bring up a lot of this could bring up a lot of interesting communication with people from your past. So you might find yourself getting text messages, emails, being on the receiving end of a lot of communication from people who you haven't spoken to in quite some time. Anyone new who comes into your life, especially through those forms of communication, right? If you get an email from somebody new who wants to collaborate with you or do whatever, you know, you might want to hold off on that, because they might not be who they seem to be or who they appear to be, not because they're trying to deceive you, but just because people have a tendency not to show up as they are when Venus is in retrograde. This could also be a really good time to sort of deal with any issues in relationship with siblings, with extended family members like cousins, aunts, uncles, with neighbors and people in your neighborhood. And so when Venus is in retrograde in your third house, if you have any issues or disputes with any of those types of people, like maybe you have a neighbor that you're always fighting because they're loud or, you know, whatever, you can hash it out during this time. You can resolve those issues. You can revisit it, right? So that's a good thing that you can do with this energy. So yeah, so Libra for Leo and for Leo rising. For Virgo and for Virgo rising, this energy is happening in your third house of communication. So Venus is stationing at 10 degrees in the sign of Scorpio on the 5th. And so from that time onward, for the next couple of weeks, you might find that you're getting a lot of communication, maybe intense communication from people from your past that you haven't spoken to or thought about in quite some time. And so these people might be coming back into your life. They might be reaching out to you. There might be some sort of old issue or trauma or insecurity or vulnerability or power struggle from the past that comes back around that you have to deal with as a result of this energy. You might find yourself having to deal a lot more with any sorts of issues in your relationships with your siblings, with your extended family members, like your cousins, your aunts and uncles, your neighbors. And so if there are disputes with people in your neighborhood or people in your community, they can come back up right now. So you can work through those disputes and come to a reasonable agreement that leaves you feeling much more empowered moving forward. And then when it moves back into your second house for Virgo and Virgo rising, this is going to bring up issues involving finances. So this is not a good time for Virgo rising people, especially toward the end of October, beginning of November, to spend money on luxury items or anything that's super over the top and super luxurious, just because you might regret actually doing that when Venus moves forward. This is a really good time for refinancing things, for renegotiating the contracts and agreements with loans and things like that, for renegotiating your pay, right? Asking for a raise. Although sometimes when Venus is in retrograde, we're a little less confident about it, or maybe we're overly confident about it, depending on who you are. That might work to your benefit, right? But Venus moving retrograde into your second house could be good for renegotiating payment. It's not necessarily good for taking out a new loan or for making those big purchases. But if you want to, especially for Virgo and Virgo rising, the second half of October into November, there's a lot of good energy for repurposing things, for thrifting, right? Virgos tend to be quite frugal. And so this is a really great time to go to the antique shop, to go to the secondhand store, to buy a used something, right? And you can repurpose it or make it better or make it your own or make it new again. And so that's something that you can do with that energy. But yeah, so financial issues could come back around if there's something from your past that's left unresolved, like maybe a debt that you forgot about, or you thought that it actually was resolved, that could come back around. You might get that collections letter. And so that might be something that you have to work on, figuring out, renegotiating, paying off, whatever it is. So, that's what's up for Virgo and for Virgo rising. For Libra and for Libra rising, this Venus retrograde is starting in your second house of finances, of money, of material possessions. And so with Venus retrograding in the sign of Scorpio, there might be something that you have to revisit or reorganize or redo involving your finances. This is a good time to, again, refinance something, to renegotiate the terms of a loan, to renegotiate your pay, to rebudget, right? To look at your budget, revise it, renew it, redo it. In Scorpio, this could be you maybe revisiting some sort of investment that you've made and maybe changing some of the terms of that investment or that agreement, or it could be you maybe cashing in on an investment, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that when Venus is retrograde, unless there are other things going on in your chart. What else could be going on for the second house? So that's mostly a lot of financial stuff that's coming up. Anything that has caused you to feel disempowered due to a financial situation in the past, that energy can come back around. It doesn't mean that that situation will come back around, but on a psycho-emotional level, you might be thinking about that. It might be coming up due to the circumstances that are coming up for you right now, or just because it's coming up for you to deal with, for you to work through, so you can feel much more empowered when it comes to your financial situation. This could also bring up a need to renegotiate or hash out things or it could even bring power struggles in joint finances or something like that. Even though it is in your second house, it is in the sign of Scorpio. When Venus moves into your first house, this could cause you to feel a little less charismatic, a little less yourself when it comes to the way that you show up with your appearance. It could make you feel a little just less self-confident, a little less self-assured, or it could cause you to feel a little extra self-assured, a little extra confident, especially in your appearance and the way that you show up in the world. And, if that is the case, there could potentially be some sort of hit to your ego or to your pride, and that's sometimes the case with Venus going retrograde. But for the most part, Venus being in Libra can bring up, it could be you going and revisiting old relationships, right? Because it's you actually actively doing it. So this could be that you feel the need to revisit an old flame, that you feel the need to reintegrate an old relationship back into your life, or to work through the issues and resolve any sort of karma that's been left unresolved in your past relationships. And so, old relationships can come back around, but usually when it's in your first house, it's because you actually brought them back. So, just be aware of who you're bringing back and why. But for the most part, it's a good thing. It's going to help you to release old karma, to resolve old wounds, and to reintegrate people into your life that you might have really loved to have in your life. It doesn't have to be romantic partnerships. It could be anyone, close friends, close family members, business partnerships, clients, things like that. If you work with clients, you could call, maybe send out a new newsletter or something like that, and a lot of your old clients might come back to you. So there's a lot of different things you can do with that energy. All right, and for Scorpio and Scorpio rising, this is stationing to go retrograde in your first house, which is the house of yourself, your appearance, your body, the way you show up in the world, the way that you sort of perceive the world, and the way that you're perceived by others. And so when Venus is retrograde in Scorpio, so people might perceive you as being more charismatic, more lovable, more beautiful, all of these types of things, more self-assured, like you have higher self-esteem, but you're probably not going to be feeling that way. When Venus goes retrograde in the sign of Scorpio, especially if you're a Scorpio rising or if it's hitting your sun, it could make you feel like unrecognized or unimportant. It can make you feel unlovable, or just not as good as you normally feel about yourself. So it could bring a hit to your self-esteem. When it's stationing to go retrograde, though, it's quite strong, so that could actually be a little bit of an ego boost. But there is potential, if you are feeling overconfident and over self-assured, right, and extra beautiful and all of that, that there could be a hit to your ego. It's not necessarily anything permanent, but it would just be, a little something to take you down a peg or two. That's not always the case, but sometimes it's the case. But yeah, Venus stationing to go retrograde. And then also with Venus going retrograde in your first house, again, that could bring up relationships from the past, but because you brought them up. So if relationships do come back around and they come back into your life during this time, it's usually because you sought that out, either to resolve some sort of unresolved trauma or issue or insecurity or vulnerability, like you wanted to confront somebody about something that you never confronted them about from the past. This is a time when you might decide to do that, so that way you can resolve that, and you can, free yourself from that past baggage, that past karma. And especially when Venus goes retrograde back into your 12th house, that's a lot of old karmic stuff in relationship that's coming back around. So really strange karmic connections. You'll probably find yourself dreaming about exes and people from your past a lot more when Venus moves back into Libra end of October through, the middle of November. This is going to be a time when your dreams will become much more vivid, much more colorful. This is a really good time to seek solitude, to spend time sort of out of partnership if you can, or spend a little bit more time with yourself, or in partnership, you can escape with your partner, right? If you have a really good relationship, and that could be something you could do with that as well. But really, this is about wrapping up, right? It's about endings in the 12th house. So this is old karma, old baggage, old insecurities from past relationships, and old relationships themselves that maybe you've never fully let go of. And these relationships now, you need to reintegrate them, or let them go fully and completely. And so that's what's going to be going on for Scorpio and Scorpio rising. For Sagittarius and Sagittarius rising, Venus is stationing to go retrograde in your 12th house, and that's, again, the house of endings, the house of karma, the house of letting go. When Venus retrogrades through your 12th house, this is a time of major karmic endings in relationships, contracts, agreements with other people, financial situations that maybe you need to wrap up and let go of, power struggles, especially in relationship or with finances. All of these things are all of these things are going to probably start coming up for you in one way or another over these next couple of weeks. So you can either reintegrate that energy back into your life, or so you can let it go completely. And usually it is letting it go, right? Because this is the house of endings. This is the 12th house. With Venus retrograding in your 12th house, this could bring up issues involving people in 12th house institutions. So sort of reintegrating the energy or connecting with people or reconnecting with people who work in those 12th house institutions. It could be very literal, right? So that could be like hospitals, prisons, ashrams, monasteries, brothels, any place that's really hidden away from the world intentionally. That's the type of institution that would be associated with the 12th house. So you could find yourself connecting or reconnecting with people in these types of institutions. This is also another really important time to pay attention to your dreams. You might be working through old relationship karma through your dreams. And so people might come up in your dreams. And, if they do, it's a sign that you need to sort of look at that, think about it, think about that relationship, sort of rehash some of that past experience with that person, so you can work through old baggage, old fears, old karmas, old power struggles and difficulties in those relationships, so that way you can let it go completely and fully. Or maybe that's a sign that you need to reach out and connect with that person, reconnect with that person, so you can reintegrate them back into your life. When Venus goes back into the sign of Libra, this is going to be in your 11th house, which is about friends, social networks, the people that you surround yourself with by choice. And so with Venus in the 11th house, you can find yourself at the end of October through, the middle of November, with a lot of friends and networks and groups of people, and even people that you connected with through charity events and organizations. That's an 11th house thing, or via the internet. You can find these people coming back around. So a lot of old friends might show up for you. And so you might find yourself reconnecting with a lot of friendships from your past, which can be really great. Or it could just be for, a season, for a moment, to help you to either reintegrate or let go of that relationship, so that way you're clear moving forward and you don't have that baggage hanging over your head of like a bad friendship that sort of went south. And so, so Venus retrograde in your 11th house. That's pretty much what's going on there. So let's move on to Capricorn. For Capricorn and Capricorn rising, Venus is stationing to go retrograde in your 11th house of friends, social networks, the people that you surround yourself with by choice. This is also the house of charitable, humanitarian types of groups or organizations that you could be a part of. This is also the house that has to do with social media. And so you might find that through social media, you have a lot of people from your past popping up, old friends especially. A little less old flames and a little more old friends in the 11th house. So people from your past, past friendships, past social networks, people that you worked with for humanitarian or charitable organizations from the past, these types of things can come back up for you. And so if people from your past come back up, especially if it was a very difficult friendship or it ended badly, or if there are power struggles or issues or traumas or, different sort of intense situations that came up during the course of this friendship, you might be bringing them back up into your life, so that way you can work through those issues once and for all, so that way you can let it go, and so you can move on with much more clarity and feeling much more empowered in your relationships. So you can have much better relationships moving forward, where you feel empowered, you feel safe, you're a little less sensitive to betrayal, which is definitely a Scorpio on the 11th house thing, is that you tend to probably keep your social circles a little bit smaller, just because you're more sensitive to betrayal and you vet people a little bit better. And so you want deep, intimate, close friendships and relationships. And so you might reintegrate old friendships in the past that were really great. And so that's a really good thing about this transit, is that old friendships can come back around. So people that you haven't heard from in forever, and you're like, wow, I really miss this person. I'm so glad they're back in my life. Or you might feel like you need to reach out to that person for whatever reason. And so that might bring them back into your life. With Venus retrograding into your 10th house, this could bring up issues involving past employment. So you might have a past employer that calls you, that wants something, that needs something, that maybe wants to invite you to, reapply for a new job there or something like that. You might run into old bosses, old coworkers. This could involve renegotiating the contract of your payment for your career, for your job, for what it is that you're doing out in the world. So maybe asking for a raise or renegotiating a bonus or something like that. That's something that could come back around as well. This could bring up old partnerships in business. This could bring back around pretty much any connections involving business, involving your work, involving your job, your coworkers, your bosses especially, or if you are in a position of authority yourself, it could be, bringing people in that you've hired, as, or that you've employed in the past. And so these types of things can come back around. Let's see. In Libra. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, now I remember, is that creative projects from the past in your job and in your work that maybe you've let fall by the wayside, or maybe they weren't done properly or appropriately, or financial projects, right? So if you work in any sort of area involving finance, involving, money, accounting, those types of things, that could come back around. You might have to rebalance the budget. You might have to redo something with those types of projects, especially those creative projects like design and things like that. You might have to kind of go back and forth and revisit and hone in on things and reintegrate things. And so this is going to be a time of refinement for you in your work and in your career, especially through creativity, through finance, and through connections with other people that you work with. All right, so Aquarius and Aquarius rising, this is happening in your 10th house. And so Venus retrograding in Scorpio in your 10th house could bring up power struggles involving finances, power struggles with people who you work for, so your employers, your bosses, people who are in positions of power over you. This could bring up old relationships with coworkers or people from your past in your work experience. This could be you having to redo or revisit some sort of project, especially a creative project or a financial one, or a little bit of both, where you might have to rebalance that budget. You might have to redo something with some sort of creative project, especially if it involves design or aesthetics in some sort of way, or retail. And so this could be you having to kind of go back and forth and refine those energies so you can have a better budget that works more effectively for your business. So you can really hone in on the details of that project that you've been wanting to push through to completion, or so you can renegotiate the terms and the agreements with your employers, right? And maybe negotiate a raise or something like that. So all of these things are potentials with Venus retrograding in the sign of Scorpio. And again, that could bring up past relationships with coworkers or with bosses. They might come back around. You might run into them unexpectedly, or you might reach out. Maybe, you want to go back to your old job and you want to see if they have any openings. That could be part of it too. And then when Venus goes retrograde into your 9th house, which will happen end of October through the middle of November, this is a time when old relationships with people in foreign countries, people from school, especially from college or graduate school or something like that, they can come back around, and you might reintegrate them back into your life, or you might have to sort of hash out old issues with these people, so that way you can let them go, so you can move on with greater clarity. This could also bring up, your relationships with your teachers from the past, not just teachers in the literal sense, but just people in your life that have sort of shown you the way, right? That's, 9th house Venus types of things. This could be you looking at sort of reintegrating or renegotiating something involving travel. So you could have had some travel plans that maybe the finances didn't come through for, so you have to sort of revisit that. You have to sort of sort out your budget for this trip or something along those lines, resort out your plans. This could be you, revisiting somebody through travel. So you might be traveling around this time, and people from your past might be coming up unexpectedly in the places that you're visiting, or you might be visiting intentionally to see people that you haven't seen in quite some time, or people might travel to see you. So these are all indications for Venus retrograding into the 9th house. And then finally in Pisces. So for Pisces and Pisces rising, Venus is retrograding in your 9th house of foreign travel, of higher education, of learning through experience, of your beliefs about God, the universe, the world around you. And so part of this could be you sort of looking inward, or it could be an old relationship that comes in that causes you to look inward and re-examine your belief systems about, the world around you and the philosophies that you hold dear, right? That frame your perception of reality. And so if these philosophies, if these belief systems are disempowering to you in any sort of way, there could be somebody that comes around or comes back around and sort of points this out to you, right? And so you have to rethink the way that you believe everything, right? Really, essentially, but your beliefs about things. This could also be people from the past from foreign countries coming back around. So people that you know that live long distance that maybe you haven't connected with in quite some time might come back around. They might visit you. They might call you. You might go visit them, or they might just pop into your mind when you haven't thought about them for quite some time, because maybe there is an old issue, an old power struggle, an old insecurity or vulnerability tied to that relationship that you need to work through on a psychological or mental level and let go of. So that way, moving forward, you can feel much better and much more clear, much more optimistic, so you can see the broader picture and the bigger perspective, which is also ninth house stuff. Venus retrograding into your 8th house is going to make things feel a little bit more intense. And so when Venus retrogrades into the 8th house, this could very literally bring up power struggles in relationships, especially old unresolved power struggles in relationships, or past relationships where there was an unequal or an uneven distribution of power, where you felt disempowered through this relationship. And so these sorts of issues can come back around. If this relationship does come back around, it is because, most likely, because you need to work through those old issues, and you need to work through those old traumas, and you need to allow yourself to feel liberated and free and more empowered moving forward in your relationships. This is also a good time to refinance any sort of debt, to pay off debts, to rebalance your budget. This could also bring up power struggles involving joint finances, debt, other people's money, those types of things. And so you might have to work on coming into an agreement, a collaboration, or coming back into balance in that respect. But for the most part, Venus in the 8th house is going to bring up a lot of deep psychological stuff involving relationships. And so your old wounds and old baggage might come back around or come back up on an internal level. So you might have to deal with it and either reintegrate parts of those experiences or those relationships, or, really purge, let go, transform it into something that helps you to feel much more empowered moving forward. All right, you guys, that was the forecast for all 12 signs. I hope you all have a really wonderful week, and I will see you guys next week for the weekly forecast. Bye.